Okay, let's get started then. So I'm very pleased to have Joël Collin-Demers, who is the consulting principal at Pure Procurement, based out of Montreal. Joël, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I apologize for the tongue twister that is my company name. But first of all, but yeah, I'm doing great. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good stuff. Excellent. So we've got some topics lined up to discuss today based around an area that's very much of interest to both of us, digital procurement, digital transformation. Within that, we're obviously going to be looking at a wide range of areas, but a couple of focus areas are looking at best of breed versus kind of suite type approaches from the technology side, and also looking at the specific challenges that sit around the procurement of complex services. But before we get into that, as we always like to do on this podcast, it'd be great to get a bit of an understanding of your background. Just talk to people kind of how you came through your procurement journey, and where you are now and what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. So I started my career in Australia on an internship with a consulting firm down there when I was there on exchange, and they were focused on business process management, pure business process management. So, mapping processes, looking at the inefficiencies and the optimization opportunities in there. And I kind of got the bug at that point in time, came back, and I was doing a Bachelor of Business and Administration with specialization in IT management. And consulting was something that was of interest to me as well, just because of the fact that you were able to see a lot of different industries, a lot of different businesses, ways of doing things in a relatively short amount of time compared to, working in industry for 5-10 years at a time in different companies. So that was the main draw. And then worked at IBM out of university for 7 years or thereabouts, and started implementing SAP, materials management, the purchasing module with clients, and then kind of grew from there, right? Because the question for me was always, what is the best tool set? What's the best way to give an application portfolio or an application architecture to procurement for them to reach their business objectives as easily as possible. And so ended up managing the procurement implementation or system implementation practice at IBM Canada. And 3 years ago, I want to say 3-4 years ago, went out on my own to be able to branch off into even more systems. So not just the SAP portfolio, but also looking at, with the other ERPs, whether it be Oracle, JD Edwards, understanding those better, understanding the source to pay suites better. So whether it be Coupa, Evalua, Ariba, GEP, Jagger, all those suites as well. And also looking at more pure play technologies, right? So the teal books, the CVOs, all the different technologies that are out there that were created to solve a specific problem within a vertical in that procurement value chain, right? So yeah, in the last 4 years, I've been in my firm, Pure Procurement, and I also get to learn about new technologies as I go through, and it's always in the quest to be able to provide the best answer to, how do I solve for different procurement challenges or objectives that I have within a business, and being able to adapt that answer to different industries, different contexts, different spend profiles. So in a nutshell, that's where I've come from, and that's what I've tried to build as an expertise over time, and it's remained interesting. So I'm still here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there aren't really that many specialized systems experts in the field that you're in terms of the breadth of experience and understanding that you've got. And it's an exploding field. I was at a really interesting meeting earlier in the week that Kearney were running, Dr. Eloise Epstein, and it was with ProcureTech, Lance Younger's company, making him a very famous cyclist there for a second. Really interesting looking at Eloise's kind of market map, where I don't know if you've seen it, the Kearney market map board.
The spider map.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
Just incredible how quickly it's growing, and it was brilliant to have lots of those companies there and some kind of corporates there as well, and various analysts and investors and stuff like that, just getting involved in the conversation. It's a rapidly expanding area, and people are constantly looking for specialist solutions. In fact, I was randomly having a conversation the other night with where I was taking my daughter to a sports club, and one of the other dads, I was just chatting to them, and they happen to work in procurement, and they were saying, yeah, I'm really looking for a contract manufacturing outsourcing platform. And people are looking for these really specialist needs right now in procurement. So it's a huge growth area. But
and it's I was actually, just to finish on that point, I was actually posting something on LinkedIn yesterday where I'm going, it's to a point where there's a paradox of choice, where we have all this choice of different solutions to be able to cater to procurement's needs, but there's so many of them, but that trying to analyze them all will only get you unhappy with the outcome, regardless of what the outcome is, because there's too much to do, right? It's like when you're shopping for a pair of jeans, if there's only 3 choices to choose from, then you do your analysis quickly, you pick one, and you're happy with the outcome, generally speaking. But if you go to Levi's and there's 300 pairs of jeans, you're going, oh, I'm going to be here all afternoon, and I won't be satisfied with what I get when I come out either, right? So we're kind of getting into that phase of the procurement application market these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the way you describe yourself. I think I saw this on LinkedIn, where you described yourself as a translator between procurement and IT. Right. I think that's a very apt description. It's something that's kind of within some organizations, it maybe ties in a little bit to what they're doing around procurement excellence. But I think in terms of being able to bring that advisory to the party, it's a very critical area.
For sure, because it's, the way I see it. So I grew up in the IT world, and then one of the things I left out when you asked me to introduce myself is I also did a master's or a certificate in strategic procurement, because I wanted to be able to develop that piece as well. And to me, I know all the IT processes, right? How you deploy changes through a landscape, how you manage an IT landscape for an ERP, the difference between an incident ticket and a request ticket, and just being able to navigate the IT organization. And often, if you've spent your entire career in procurement, you don't necessarily have that visibility or that skill set, right? So coming to the table, to a CPO's office, to a procurement director's office, category managers, and having the discussion around, okay, well, here, what are you trying to get to as a business outcome? And then let's solve for that with technology. Whereas sometimes I feel like we take the inverse approach, where we'll buy technology and we'll try to make it fit to the procurement organization. So yeah, I've seen that being at the intersection of those two things, and for any business function, really being able to understand how to navigate the IT department and the technology piece to serve the business is really an interesting place to be at, right? And so in that advisory, I also really push CPOs and procurement organizations to build up the digital and just IT literacy of their folks in general, because that's something that'll allow you to go faster in your innovation within your organization, especially with large enterprises, of course.
And how do you see that if you look through the different strata of kind of roles and functions within procurement? Do you see much kind of pushback from people at any level within procurement around technology, in terms of, I don't want to be automated, we don't want to change things? What are the kind of, do you see any of that sort of kind of negative fear factor, or do you think most people are pretty bought in?
Yeah, most people are pretty bought in, I think, because they see, I think it's an older mentality where, if you've been around and you've done a couple technology projects over the years, you'll see that it doesn't necessarily take you out of the picture or automate you as a procurement professional. What it does is it changes the nature of your problems. So instead of dealing with how are we going to get all this amount of work done, right, which is more like, I don't know, updating price lists on a monthly basis. Well, if we're able to automate that, then the problem becomes, okay, well, how do we make sure that we're actually paying those prices when we order, and we loop that back with the invoicing process, and we're able to have better visibility into the compliance to those prices, right, and the actual usage. And so as you go up through the maturity curve of the technological capabilities that you have in your organization, the nature of your problem change, but you still have all these questions to answer, and all these other things that you'd be able to do to extract more value from procurement.
Yeah, it's moving away from transactional into strategic activities, and it elevates the game of procurement, and it means the type of skills required in procurement start moving more towards the analytical side of things, the strategic side of things. But I think it's great in terms of bringing a new generation into procurement. And I would say that if you're kind of like the current generation coming out of university, looking for their first jobs, really smart people, then they're going to expect a decent level of digitalization within organizations so that they can actually use those higher level skills. Whereas I think, if companies get caught behind the curve trying to be too, stick to old fashioned processes, it's just going to be unattractive to the new wave of talent coming in as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one, right? And I would also argue you have a wider set of skills, right? So we see ESG, like being able to do more spend analysis, being able to spend more time on vendor relationship management, or really specific niche categories and developing strategies for those where, without systems, we were doing more of a blanket approach where, we have 3 different types of processes and now we can afford to have 14 to be very niche and target very specific characteristics of a category or subcategory, right? So yeah, I think you're totally right? It's being able to have that tool set and offer those tools to the younger generation is also a differentiator in terms of recruitment and potentially retention.
Yeah, so you touched on an interesting point earlier about taking a strategic approach, understanding what the goals, aims, problems are of an organization before you start even thinking about technology, rather than trying to make technology fit as looking at what's happening as standard. I think that's a really crucial point, and it's something that a couple of the enterprise procurement professionals who were at this event the other day and some of the tech companies were bringing up. It's just about there's no point in digitalizing a poor process. And quite often that can happen, where you're basically taking something that's inefficient and making it inefficient in a digital format. That's not what it's all about.
Yeah.
So would you be able to talk a little bit about how you typically advise organizations, and what the sort of problems and starting point that you usually come across?
Sure. And just to add on to what you were saying, the best way I've ever heard it said is, if you have a chaotic process and you automate it, you're just going to have automated chaos, right?
Exactly. The best kind of chaos.
Yeah, that's right. So I've always found that to be very very visual, right, in terms of explaining it. But anyways, to answer your question more directly to how I would approach like a mandate with certain clients, for me, it's all about road mapping, right? And being able to understand, okay, what is the organization's spend profile? So are you in manufacturing and you have a lot of direct spend? You also have some indirect spend, and we need to consider both of those in the architecture of the systems. And when I say the architecture of the systems, I mean agnostic of technology, right? So there's like 7 main blocks that I see in procurement system architecture. There's spend analysis at the front, then we get into sourcing and category management strategies. Then we get into CLM or contract lifecycle management. And once we've got, that's more of the strategic procurement modules. We've got, then when we get into more operational purchasing, we've got the procure to pay or procure to order modules where we're cutting recs, approvals, purchase orders, doing goods receipts or service receipts. We've got invoicing and accounts payables. And then we've got supplier relationship management that kind of, is threaded across the entire value chain, right? So those are the big pieces. And then I'd look at those big pieces with that company's spend profile and their organizational profile as well. Are they based in North America? Are they global? What are the other considerations that we need to have in there from an IT standpoint? And finally, the deployment strategy based on existing constraints, right? So is there already 18 ERPs that we need to take into consideration, or is there one single ERP? Is there already a source to pay tool in there somewhere? Like, are there other tools that we need to take stock of before starting? And so we have kind of all the pieces, right? We have, okay, what's our business profile, spend profile? What do we have in terms of objectives for each of those blocks I mentioned, right? Where are the big value drivers for our business and our industry? And then fourth, third, what's the constraints that we have to play with, right, from an IT standpoint? And once you've got all those components, you can start to think about, okay, well, what's the highest priority from a benefit standpoint? What's the highest priority, or what's the easiest thing to implement from an adoption standpoint? to get the ball rolling? And what other constraints do we need to think about in terms of IT projects that are on the roadmap? Are you replacing an ERP system? Is it a fresh ERP system? Do you have other constraints, other projects that are coming and interfering, or that need to be considered in a roadmap? And then once you do that, it's an iterative process, right? You'll put it on the table once. We'll look at it, poke holes in it, and adjust it, and eventually we get to, okay, this is where we're at. This is where we want to get to. These are the value drivers. These are the adoption drivers. These are the constraints that we need to be aware of. And then it's all about execution, right? Like crafting that initial strategy is relatively easy in the grand scheme of things. The execution afterwards, the plan is you're never going to execute 100% on the plan. So you always need to keep updating that roadmap as new information becomes available as well. And as you face different challenges within the implementation of the projects, but doing that and also keeping each of the pieces of that roadmap in execution as small and as simple as possible is what's going to get you from crafting that roadmap to having something that's completed in terms of desired end state.
Yeah, and that architecture, how long would you say that? I think you said 7 parts to that architecture.
Or the 7 blocks, yeah.
7 blocks. How long would you say that architecture has been established as a kind of best practice?
So do you mean theoretically?
Just in terms, yeah, because the way I'm looking at it is, you've got that kind of layout and you've got those elements to it. But if we go back to like the new crop of kind of procure tech companies that are coming out now all the time, some of them will cross over, some of them will slot in. And we can come into this later when we talk about best of breed, but it's an interesting, it's potentially like, where does that paradigm sit? How far through is that kind of top level paradigm? Those areas are always going to exist for companies. They're going to always be an important part of it. But I feel that with the options there are now in terms of the type of technologies you can use and where they overlap, that is still going to remain the same, but it feels like it could be quite fluid in how that's achieved.
Absolutely, right? Like I'm not going to have necessarily one solution that covers all of them and or one solution for each of the blocks, right? It's depending on what you're looking at. And we didn't cover that, right? Because that's kind of the piece between the system agnostic or technology agnostic roadmap and the execution is selecting the technologies to fill in that roadmap, right? And depending on the technologies that you're looking at, they're going to have a different breadth, a different depth. And so you need to be really clear on what you're trying to solve for so that you're able to then make trade-offs or make decisions based on what technologies stand out to you, right? Because you might have a technology that does everything you want it to do from a procure to pay standpoint, but they don't offer anything on the sourcing contract management side of things, right? And so you're going to have interfaces with another product, right? So those are all trade-offs that there's no silver bullet or perfect way to go about it, but it's making sure that what's the priority, right? And then let's focus on that. Let's make sure that we have open, flexible, configurable applications, right, where we're able to push data in through APIs, get data out from APIs, extract all the data from database tables, and that we're able to have some flexibility in terms of extending those APIs as needed. And if you're able to purchase and prioritize purchasing those types of solutions in your priority, right, in terms of what you're trying to accomplish from a benefit and adoption standpoint, then at least you're not painting yourself into a corner, right, by buying something that you're never going to be able to build on top of or extend.
Yeah, I guess it comes down to the fact that procurement is not uniform. It's not uniform across different organizations, in terms of how people see the world. Some people very much look at the world as direct versus indirect. Some people very much have a very specific category strategy. Some people are talking about going beyond categories and looking at the world in a slightly different way. I think that must present some pretty unique challenges for you in the sense that the way a procurement organization is set up is so different in different organizations. And the level of maturity is going to be quite different. Clearly, the type of clients you're dealing with have probably got a fairly mature setup, I would imagine, in most instances. But it's it's really not a uniform thing. It seems to me.
No, absolutely. And that's to call back to what I was saying at the outset. That's why it remains interesting and to me but important work as well, because each organization, to your point, is going to have a different profile and a different language and a different way of setting up their structure. And you might have businesses that are in the same industry but have additional divisions in other industries, and so it becomes a puzzle, right? To go through the methodology, the approach, but the questions and the constraints and the considerations are always a bit different, right? And so the answer is never quite the same. So on that point, I'd say be careful to anybody listening of falling into the best practices trap, right? Because yes, there are best practices up to a certain level of granularity, but then when you try to apply those best practices to your business, there's always going to be nuances, and there's always going to be considerations that are unique to your context. And so it's often hard to answer. Like, I get asked that question, at the beginning of relationships, and then there's an easy answer, and then as we get into the more granular issues, they go, okay, well, what's the best practice for oil and gas service purchasing for cleaning services in remote areas? And you go, like, that's so specific. Like, I don't think I can give you a best practice, right? There's no report that says how to do that. So I think it's being able to have expectations on best practices and on solutions that are realistic in terms of the granularity to which they will provide you a solution that's out of the box.
Yeah, and I guess some of the best practice is actually on the strategy side. That if you're employing strategic best practice, then in terms of how that can be applied to the rollout and the use of technology, as as long as you're following the best practice to that, it's going to have to apply to your specific circumstances. Maybe that follows some kind of 80-20 rule where, kind of 80% of the best practice is going to apply, but there's 20% that's going to be company specific, or maybe more if it's like a really specialist mining company that does something quite unique, for example. So and
I like to think of it as guiding principles, right? So like go gather the best practices that you see that are more generic, come back and say, okay, well, what is our priority? What are our guiding principles for when we'll have to take trade-off decisions? So are we going to prioritize user adoption or benefit realization? Because often those are at odds, right? So what's the priority there? If I have to roll out the most complex module to get the most benefit, that's not going to help my user adoption, right? So am I better to start with something that's a bit more simple, but that's not going to have the same amount of benefits? That's always a conversation I run into, right? So being clear on how you're going to address trade-off decisions as you meet issues is something that I think is more valuable than trying to figure out the best practices for any given scenario.
Yeah, I think that point you just made about adoption versus benefit realization, that's a huge one. Just in terms of I tend to see this quite a lot where people are maybe using slightly more legacy systems, or they've got overarching systems that they've had in place for a long period of time, and the benefit's just not there, where you've got massive forms just requiring huge amounts of information, taking up loads of time. Just the adoption fall off, it's a complete false economy where I guess if everyone was just stuck in a room saying, we need to if we collect all of this information and go to the nth degree, wow, we're going to have these incredible insights. And it's like, well, you know what? People have got to do a job, and they've actually got to think about the user. And that it brings me back to the point we were talking about earlier with regards to bridging IT and procurement. What's the kind of typical gap that you see, or what's some kind of typical scenarios that you encounter when you're addressing that when you come in fresh to a new organization?
I'd say that when you ask me that question, it's not necessarily like the biggest gap but the biggest challenge is often integration, right? Like people will be specialized in IT in a given system or a given technology, and when you come in with procurement with this roadmap that I'm speaking of, right, and you've selected maybe 1, 2, 3 technologies that are going to be your base for covering those 7 blocks I was referring to earlier, then the complexity is in making sure you have the right integration and the right people that understand how to manage integration, how to develop and deploy integration between systems, because that's often where we'll see things fall off in terms of adoption and complexity, because the integration scenarios haven't been thought out correctly, right? Because the way I think about it is, you have a business process, right? There's 10 steps to get from trigger to the end result that you're looking for. And then you're going to have maybe, have to go through 3 systems to be able to get to that end result that you're looking for. And so you have to thread the needle through of that process through those different systems. And that requires not only system interfaces, but also like potentially process interfaces. And what I mean by that is making sure that the definitions are the same throughout, right? So if I start off a requisition in a plant, which is an organizational structure concept in one system, and then I'm sending it to another system where the concept of plant doesn't exist, it's a division. And then I come back into an invoicing system and it's called an organization, then people are going to get confused when they talk to each other across the organization if they're working in those different systems, right? So thinking about how you're going to solve that, it goes back to flexibility of the systems that you're purchasing as well. Like, can we relabel things? Can we think about the technical integration piece as well? But I find that's the biggest challenge at the end of the day when you're trying to cater to the entire value chain of procurement with systems, is being able to not only have that roadmap, have that deployment strategy, but then at a granular level, how does that process and the terminology and vocabulary, how is it integrated from end to end to make sure that
totally agree. We see that a lot with things like taxonomies. Taxonomies is a huge one, but even just the kind of like you say, structured cost coding and how that's applied and what terminology is used within that. But also if the company's made acquisitions or if they've got multiple different types of operation, the layers and layers of complexity are almost infinite in the sense of some of these really, really large organizations. They are incredibly complicated, and they've grown through acquisition and ended up with this giant beast.
And hopefully, in that scenario, you'll have a center of expertise, a center of excellence that's in your procurement team that's also kind of technology focused, and they're waking up and going to bed every single day thinking about how do we remove that complexity, right? How do we, in an M&A scenario, is there a way for us to onboard those folks into an existing system, or to think about how we're going to integrate them into the culture essentially of the company and what that means at a system level.
Yeah, and another thing that I find interesting about the whole kind of interfaces and integrations side of things is I feel like in some ways it's got simpler, or I feel like the way that more modern technology operates, it can be a bit simpler, just in terms of things like using existing single sign-on, two-factor authentication and stuff like that, just across the board. So if somebody's using a new system, typically when we roll out for a customer, we'll use their internal single sign-on. So they don't have to register for a new system, create an account. They just basically access it. Single sign-on just does that straight away. That plus, white label, is that something you see people using much?
Absolutely.
Or is that not? Yeah.
White label, I'd say. So for the branding aspect of things, and then extendable APIs is the other, right? Like being able to, we have the same types of data objects throughout that value chain, right? You have RFP events, you have sourcing projects, you have contract workspaces or contract projects, you have requisitions, approvals, purchase orders, good receipt documents, invoices. Like those objects are fairly common across that value chain. So being able to, as a service provider, offer up APIs for what are going to be exports and imports of objects that are going to come from other systems, and then being able to, as part of your solution, configuration, extend those APIs to say, oh, if I need to add, an additional 2 or 3 fields to be able to cater to what that other system needs or is going to send me for that data object, is something that's absolutely gotten better, over the last 5-10 years. I think the portion that remains for integration a challenge is threading the needle on the business process end to end, right? So more the business side of things and how we fit that into IT. So it goes back to, the translation, right? Being able to have somebody at the intersection of procurement and IT.
Yeah. So obviously the kind of the underlying strategy is absolutely critical in terms of how that architecture will sit for that large enterprise. How does it kind of spring out from there? Can you talk about that in a little bit more detail? Because obviously in fact, firstly, when you're actually creating that strategy, who will typically be the key stakeholders that you're dealing with that are running that strategy internally?
Right. So it'll be either the COE I was referring to earlier, or we'll have the CPO really directly involved in it as well. So typically you'll have a center of excellence or a director or senior director that's been kind of mandated to look at the technology end to end, right? So and then we bring stakeholders into the exercise depending on what vertical we're looking at, right? And then the idea is to craft a holistic picture, make sure that folks who are responsible for the end-to-end procurement function and process agree with the business outcomes that we're trying to reach and how we're going to reach them with that roadmap, with the system agnostic technology architecture. So, in practice, how that would go about is we'd have some as-is workshops on. So we have a business process hierarchy that we develop together. We make sure we're covering the entirety of what the business does. We take the spend profile out as well. So what's the spend for the different categories, and being able to say, okay, well, and what processes in the process hierarchy match to the different categories within the spend profile. And then we have a good picture of the as is, and we go and do workshops to understand in granular fashion those as is workshops as well, if there's not already process mapping that's being maintained within the company, which is often the case, right? Or it's been done, but it was done 3, 4, or 5 years ago, hasn't been maintained. So we do the as is workshops to understand what's the current state of the situation with regards to all the processes in that hierarchy. And then we're able to say, okay, this is essentially today's picture, right? And then from there, I'll take that away, come back and discuss future state
The to-be scenario.
The to-be, exactly. When I say future state, like the desired end state, those are all synonyms, right? Propose something and say, so based on what you told me your processes are here's the 7 blocks, and here's what we would do for those 7 blocks for those different, to be able to cover those different requirements, right? Those different use cases or process scenarios. And here's what that requires in terms of technology, agnostic of solution, right? So, and then from there we go, okay, well, if you're trying to, if we all agree on that conceptual model for a target end state, we look at breaking it down into a deployment plan, right? So what do we attack first and why? What are the guiding principles that bring us to that decision? We all agree on that. And then we could start looking at, okay, well, what are the pieces of technology that'll allow us to do that deployment roadmap? And then it's kind of a back and forth as well, right? Because based on the constraints or the offerings of technology that are there, the licensing models, the licensing structure, we might come back to the deployment plan and say, okay, well, based on the fact that we really like this piece of technology and the constraints in buying that piece of technology mean X, Y, and Z, we have to adapt the deployment plan to that, or we have to accept certain costs are going to be paid and not, for licenses, and we're not going to use the product until later on, right? So it's kind of optimizing the model for the real data that we put into it as we go along. So I hope that gives you more of a perspective in terms of what that would look like in terms of a project or an engagement.
Yeah, totally, absolutely, it's super useful. I'm just wondering how on earth you're able to visualize that for people, because especially when you're dealing with different stakeholder groups, it's like you must have some incredible PowerPoints and like Gantt charts and flow diagrams, because I mean, that's something that we deal with on a level of just looking at the areas that we deal with around services procurement. Quite often it will be an as is and to be process that we're looking at. But it depends whether you're looking at, you're dealing with procurement excellence who are really deep into the process. You're dealing with the CPO. You may be dealing with internal stakeholder buyers. It's quite hard to communicate that to everybody in the same way.
Yeah, you're definitely not going to do it in the same way. So you'll have similar deliverables that explain the same information at different levels of complexity, and also with different functions in mind, right? So like an IT architecture where we're going to look at the data flows and the interfaces between systems is going to be an eyesore for the business folks who just want to know, like, what are we doing for those 7 different blocks, right? So yeah, for sure, there's different deliverables that communicate the same type of information in different ways to satisfy the requirements of different types of stakeholders.
Yeah, and that's the art in the translation that you do, really, isn't it? It's science and art.
And the other piece is that those requirements, those deliverables might change from client to client. So I could propose deliverables that do that for sure. But then if I get into an organization where IT has a very specific template for architecture drawings that they use, I'll typically adapt to the client, right? And say, I can just explain to me your nomenclature and I'll do it in that way, and work with your enterprise architect to be able to put that together. If there's, certain project management gating procedures or processes that organizations have in place, and we need to present certain things in specific formats that executives in that PMO gating process are used to looking at, I'll adapt to that as well. So, it's really, it's also very organic in that sense, where yes, I can come in with my deliverables, my standard templates, but oftentimes I'll have to tweak those, adapt those to the organization, so that we get folks understanding, right? That's the end goal at the end of the day, is to have everybody on the same page, even though it might take multiple different pages to accomplish that.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So you're creating the initial strategy, you're then creating an understanding of the process and communicating that out to get buy-in and understanding across the organization. When you're going out to get that buy-in, what does that typically look like? I mean, it's obviously going to be different in different types of organizations, but how much involvement from how many different groups do you kind of tend to advise, or again, is it very specific on the organization, case by case?
Yeah, it depends on the org, but that's where I'll most likely sit down with the change management team or the change management folks from the project, and we'll develop a strategy on the change front as well, right? So what are the power dynamics within the business? Who's got a vested interest in procurement working well, or in different verticals within the process, right? Those 7 different boxes I was referring to earlier. So looking at it, so to me, it's really putting that framework in place where we have a common language or common lens to look at all the issues through, right? So if we use those 7 boxes, then we can take change management, sit down and say, here's the 7 boxes, right? Here's how we look at it from a process and a technology standpoint. How do we need to look at it from an org standpoint in those 7 boxes as well? So if I'm talking about sourcing, and in my deployment plan, I'm going to hit sourcing first. Who's going to be impacted by that? Who needs to be involved in terms of as-is processes? And then, are we extending that for to-be processes, and we need to warn someone or get someone's input on what the new state of things is going to be? And so I think that's the approach, right? It's really using the standard, ADKAR method from ProSci. What is it? Awareness. I have it written here. Awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement, right? So we'll think about that with the change management team, and they'll do their org impact assessment and identify the stakeholders, and then we'll bring that together with the deployment plan and the 7 process areas to be able to say, okay, here's how we approach each of those stakeholder groups. Okay,
so you've worked through your strategy. You've then created an understanding of where we are now, where we're going to. You're starting to communicate that out and get buy-in. Next, I guess it's on to actually making it happen. But at that point of the process, what percentage of the hard work is done? Because I'd imagine that actually that the buy-in part of it, the understanding, the acceptance of process, the acceptance of goals, that must be quite a big part of it.
It is, and it's never over, in the sense that people are. If I have a stakeholder that I bring into the sourcing process workshops, right, or a delegate from their team, they haven't necessarily been in that workshop, so I need to convince them up to a point, or I use the word convince, I should say. They should understand what we're trying to do to a point and buy in to use the expression you're saying, right? But they'll only buy into a certain point, right? And then that buy-in and that understanding starts decaying over time, because they have all this other stuff to do, right? So we have to continuously come back, and then even when it's implemented, you still have continuous improvement, and folks need to ramp up on their maturity on the new process, the new solution. So that change management piece of understanding and buy-in, yes, you need to reach an initial threshold to pull the trigger on your project, but then you continuously need to have activities in that change management strategy to make sure that you're keeping it at a decent level, and even upgrading it over time, right? Or bringing it higher over time. So yes, that's a hard part of it. But I'd say the harder part is in execution for sure, right? So being able to execute, being able to have the right teams in place, the right people at the right time, right? To be able to respect that project management triangle for any of the pieces that are in that roadmap, because that roadmap is potentially huge, right? It's changing the entire procurement function. And as much as we want to think that procurement is as we say in French, and I'll directly translate, steak, corn, and potatoes, so like a shepherd's pie, right? Really easy to make. That's the perception, but when you get into the detail, well, do you want cream corn, or do you know in there, or standard corn? So there's complexity there for sure. So that's why I always say as well, like once you've done that hard work, like it's visionary work or strategy work to be able to craft a vision, then when you start deploying, do it in the smallest possible increments, smallest possible way, so that you're able to control that project management triangle of timeline, cost, and functionality for each of those pieces as best as possible, by keeping the teams smaller, by keeping the impacted users smaller as well. And it'll build as a snowball, right? You'll build the knowledge and the culture around those new processes and applications. We'll start with a couple super users, and then they'll grow. And if you did it right, they're going to grow by themselves over time as well, instead of having to push the rock up the hill.
Yeah, and then you've got the tech vendors to add to the party. You've got to rely on them through the execution phase as well, in terms of them supporting the process, being flexible, being there when you need them, providing the right level of expertise to help those teams.
And they'll all know their technology very well, right? But and they should. Where there's a lack is, again, in that integration to other platforms, right? They may have done it in the past as a company, doesn't necessarily mean the team that you have on your project has done it in another context. And so, you're going to face novel situations always in those types of projects. And so having folks that don't necessarily have the experience in integrating two solutions together, but have that mindset, that thinking, that methodology around integration, like, okay, what's the process end to end? What are the terms that we're using? Does it make sense end to end? And then, yes, the technology integration piece, but first and foremost, what's the process end to end, and what are we trying to accomplish when those pieces are integrated together?
Yeah, the integrations side of things is a really interesting one. It ties very much into the adoption piece as well. So let's just come on to a little bit of dive into looking at kind of like best of breed solution versus suite, or the combination of the two. So lots of the big players have now app marketplaces, app stores, whatever you want to call them, where they'll have like pre-built integrations, vetted tech partners that they can bring into the party. It feels like, to a certain extent, that's like table stakes now if you're a best of breed provider, in the sense you need to be turning up and have solved that problem already, really, if you're selling into an organization. I guess it depends at what point you're coming into their program. But yeah, what's your view on the kind of the use of app marketplaces, and how much value do you see in that, in the way that they're currently used?
Yeah, the app marketplaces themselves, like, I think it's nascent, and the apps might resolve a very specific problem, but I haven't seen apps where I'll download a new service procurement module for my source to pay solution, right? Like, it's not as wide a breadth. So I think there is value to those app marketplaces for specific use cases, but typically they won't be as complex, right? At least in the use cases that I've seen. So when I talk about integration, it's more like, a sourcing application with a CLM application, right? Making those work together. If you're in a source to pay and you're adding, a third-party approval application that sits on top of your platform, then I think that's, to your point, table stakes. Like, it's going to work natively out of the box. You just install it. And the terms are the same because it's been built for sitting on that application. So I'd look at it as two different categories, right? Of extensions, if I can put it that way, which I see more in the app marketplaces, versus really a new module, a new functionality that you're integrating with another technology, another code base.
It's really interesting you say that, actually, because I would venture an opinion that that's starting to merge. And it may be something that's certainly happening right now. I mean, from our point of view, you could look at it as a new system, a new package for managing specifically the procurement, contracting, and delivery of complex services across those relevant categories. But from our point of view as a tech vendor, we need to be ready to go within a source to pay environment, for example. So it kind of crosses over with that app marketplace concept, in the sense that you need to have an integration ready to go so that an organization can switch you on within their source to pay environment, rather than having the conversation where it's like, we've got this solution that's going to massively increase value in your complex services categories, but it's completely separate to everything you've got. It's a whole giant project. Your main vendor has never heard of them, and it's just a whole world of problems. So it feels like those two sides of that are merging, in the sense that
I hope so. I hope so.
I think they have to. I think that's the way it has to go, because you've obviously got some apps are very, very simplistic and will be very, very small. The beauty is they're there and they're ready to go. But even the more sophisticated ones now have to try and play in that way and offer their services in that way. It's just the way that infrastructure is set up, and that's the way, when you look at the Kearney market map, you've got these systems in the center, and a lot of the other players are really, part of their play is to make sure that they can integrate or are already integrated with them before they even really hit the market at high speed. So it's
and
a
I see
area.
those out of the box integrations, which it's potentially where we're at today, that I'm seeing on the field. And then if we can get to, hey, I go into an app store and I install this new application, and there, it just comes with the standard integration as well, then great, man. If we could get there, I'd be a happy camper for sure. The only thing I'd say is I would still do my due diligence as an organization before installing those apps, right? I still do the testing and make sure that from a process standpoint, the terminology makes sense. Because to the point that we've been discussing earlier, like if you're a service provider and you plug into a bunch of different marketplaces, a bunch of different source to pay solutions, then I would also expect that you've done that homework on the process front and the terminology front, and that if I download you in the iValue marketplace, well, you're going to align your labels and your terms and your fields to what needs to what is needed to work with the iValue use cases. Whereas if you're doing it with Ariba, with Coupa, with GEP, that you've done that as well, right? So that your application kind of is a chameleon depending on the marketplace where it's at, and you're not only integrating technically, but you're also integrating from a process standpoint and the different data objects that are required in those to make that other system work, right?
Yeah, I guess when you get to the level of complexity of a significant additional value add, it's going to be about configurations as well. So I think there's an onus of responsibility that sits with these kind of up and coming best of breed vendors to make sure. So I guess there's two sides to it. There's integrations, and then there's app marketplaces. So first and foremost, the onus of responsibility is there on those tech vendors to make the effort, do the work, be first, and have those integrations ready to go. Yep. Because then at that point, you can work with the end client, you can carry out the necessary configurations. And even if you line up with, Coupa's taxonomy, for example, that might be used differently within a specific organization because they've got their own very complicated oil and gas taxonomy. So I think configurations are always going to be key. But yeah, maybe that's where the differentiator sits, in the sense that you've got this kind of, there's integrations, there's app marketplace, there's a different level of complexity or perception of how the complexity is going to work. But I think more and more you'll see the more complex solutions sitting within the remit of the app marketplace, where they're not necessarily completely plug and play, because then it needs to be more considered than that. But for the end client to be able to purchase them, they know that the basics are already there. They can speak to the systems they've got in place. And then it's a quick, because even if two people are using iValue, they're not necessarily going to be using it in the same way.
Right, exactly. And I think that's a good vision that you're laying out, right? Like to get into a marketplace, you'd have to have some level, some standard of integration that you've met with that other application. I think you still need to do that due diligence, but it's going to be an accelerator, right? It's going to shorten that time for what needs to be done to be able to turn on the lights to that application, to that integration, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So if you look at the process of this digital transformation within a procurement function in a large organization, at what stage would you say is appropriate for the organization to start thinking about best of breed? Because clearly in that maturity curve, there are going to be big platforms, big base platforms coming in. Probably, I would imagine at the earliest levels, some of the bigger architecture is going to come in, but, guide me on that. My assumption would be best of breed might need to be a little bit further down the line when the gaps are more understood, or am I missing the point on that one?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to see it, right? It's either I'm going to go get a best of breed that I can use without any integration. So like, I think of one that comes to mind that I like a lot is Parangusta. So like procurement performance management, like I can start looking at my portfolio and things that move the needle without integrating into anything else, right? So that's a pure play system that I can put in. And then I'm going to look at building up my base, right? So my ERP system is, as I'm a bigger enterprise or become a bigger enterprise, is going to be key because it integrates with all my other systems, my other processes, my other functions, right? Finance, maintenance, production, etc., HR. And so I need to have that base there. And then whatever I can't do within that base, that's when I look to either a source to pay platform, or if that's overkill for my business, then niche pure play solutions that'll come and augment my ERP capabilities, right? So that's the way I see it. Is if you're able to go get pure play solutions without the integration piece up front, or they're going to drive significant amounts of value for that 20% of your business that drives 70% of the benefit in terms of procurement, then you can put pure play up front. But otherwise, you're going to look at, okay, what does my base do? Optimize my base. Whatever my base can't do, like if an ERP system can't do any sourcing, then you're going to go get a sourcing tool to fill out that block, right, in your architecture. Or you might get a source to pay, an entire source to pay suite, depending on what you're trying to achieve and the profile of your organization. And then whatever that other system can't do, that's when you're going to look to other pure play applications to do for you as well, right? Depending on the pain points that you have within your organization, right? So if I could give another concrete example with HICX or HICS. So they're a really interesting supplier management platform, like along with like the Teal Books of this world. Where if I have a ton of suppliers, right, and I need better master data management and just overall supplier relationship management governance processes, then I might be willing to get one of those pure play applications to help me do that, because my ERP or my source to pay system doesn't meet the mark in terms of my requirements, right? But as well, I think what's going to happen, what happens when you start looking at that is that there's the pure play solutions theoretically are typically more expensive to support that vertical than, say, doing it in ERP or doing it in a source to pay, because you're cutting the cost of your licenses across the entire value chain, right? So you really have to have specific use cases or specific volumes or problems that are generating a lot of headaches for you, or a lot of FTEs that are dedicated to solving that problem for it to be worth the extra cost of a pure play solution for that given vertical.
Yeah, and I guess it depends when the problem rears its head.
Yeah.
I mean, so to come on to another area that I'm really interested to get your opinion on, which is just looking at this as in the context of whether you're buying goods and materials or whether you're buying services, and in particular, more complex services that by their very nature are much more varied, hard to define, simpler supply chain than goods and materials, but just more kind of intangible. I feel like in our experience with the procurement of services, it's something that maybe gets identified later, in the sense that within traditional top level kind of procure to pay platforms, I don't feel there's necessarily the same emphasis given towards services specifically than there is towards goods and materials, like catalog buying, all that sort of structured process that's much more difficult to apply to services. That feels like the sort of problem that kind of comes up later when people have solved the base issues and got the base processes in place. At some point, somebody's going to kind of go, hang on, with all of that spend, we don't really know what we're getting for it. What do you see in terms of the main differences?
So I'd concur with what you're saying, right? Where it typically kind of gets pushed out on the technology roadmap. Doesn't have to, right? If it's an area where you've got a lot of spend and there's a lot of opportunity, then you could certainly do it in parallel, or have another application that's specifically dedicated to services. Because to your point, whether it's an ERP, a source to pay platform, they're not typically optimized for service, for all the different types of service purchasing. Having said that, I think if we get into services, like services is a very broad category, and I like to put it on a continuum of the certainty of what I'm buying versus the uncertainty of what I'm buying. And then there's a continuum there in terms of services, right? So if I'm buying cleaning services for a very specific area or building or within office space within my business, then I go back to my project management triangle, right? I know how much the company knows how much time it's going to take. They know how much it's going to cost, and they know the exact scope of what they're needing to do. So that service is very certain. And so it's very much like buying a good, right? Like I can buy it through a goods purchasing process without too much trouble, even though it's a service. But as I go on that continuum towards uncertainty of what I'm buying up front, so let's say an IT project to implement an application, right? Where I know the rates of the consultants or the folks that are coming in, or I have a fixed price. But let's stick with the rates because that makes it even more uncertain, right? I know the rates, I know the scope. We've signed a statement of work to some level, but there's a bunch of different, caveats and assumptions there that if they change, I subject myself to a change order. So the scope is known but unknown at the same time, depending on the complexity of the application, of course. And then the timeline usually is good, but if you touch the scope, then the timeline changes as well, right? So when you get to those types of services, then you can't buy them the same way that you do with a cleaning service, right? You need something a bit more flexible that's going to allow you to change that purchase order, that purchasing device over time as things change, and that you have the proper control and governance around that process as well, right? And then in that type of uncertain service, there's two I see a lot, like linked to a work order for maintenance, right? So if somebody comes in to fix a machine, we know they need to fix the machine. They typically have a time to do so, but we don't know how much it's going to cost because they don't necessarily know the problem until they open up the machine, right? So it's linked to a work order. I need to have a purchase order to be able to do that. But that purchase order, the value of that might change. And so do I want to reapprove it 7 times? No. Do I know exactly the problem might go upstream and then we might have to open new work orders. So that there's complexity in the maintenance piece. And then as I was referring to IT projects where I might have timesheets, right? I might have folks that are entering timesheets, and we might or might not know on which projects they're going to put their time on any given week. So I can't necessarily have the accounting info set in my purchase order before the timesheet comes in. So I need to be able to change accounting information as the work gets completed, right? So those are like some of the things that you should think about when you're thinking about how you're going to support your services with an IT application. And then those requirements will dictate, am I trying to buy simple services that are very certain, or am I further along that continuum of uncertainty? And I need to have more complex considerations for the solution that I would be buying.
I think that's a brilliant description. I really like that in terms of that continuum. So you kind of on the far left, if you've got your kind of certainty, high certainty, simple services, that's maybe kind of like commoditized services, like an Amazon business type approach where you can catalog and structure it and make it much more transactional. Yeah. And then on the far right-hand side, where you're getting to these really complex and uncertain services, it could be a big IT project. It could be a piece of consulting work. It starts out looking simple and then it starts out looking this big and it ends up that big.
Construction, all those types of services where you won't know what the cost is 100% until it's done, right? Until you get the final invoice. And so a lot of organizations are ill-equipped to be able to manage that. And so, they end up either managing it manually, or they'll wait till the invoice comes in and then do the purchase order process after the fact, which is counterproductive to why you're doing purchase orders in the first place, right? So that's where I think pure play solutions, especially in the service space, have a gap to fill and a story to tell and a value proposition to offer is around those complex services more and more.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you apply that. Ultimately it's the services may be different, but those complex services are all going to be procured in a similar way.
Yep.
The problems of complexity that exist with them are going to be managed through change orders, updating the overall statement of work, understanding what you started out with, understanding where you got to, how long it took, what changed, who changed it, why.
And sending the cost to the right place, right? To the work order or to a project plan, or so the accounting as well comes and trips you up on those different scenarios.
Yeah. And it's just, it's a very, very different process to manage. And I think it's interesting because it's an area where if you look at certain industries, it will account for like 95% of their spend. If you look at like financial services, but even if you look at like manufacturing organizations, their spend on services is going up, and it's becoming more and more important. So I think when you look at where the big, for example, procure to pay systems came into play, services weren't such a big part of the landscape, and the industry was at a very immature stage. So it was like, urgently get the basics under control and get the goods and materials side of things under control. I think that's really starting to evolve and move now, but it's a difficult problem to solve. It's a very complex problem, but that's where
you'll spend many years optimizing the services purchasing piece of the categories with technology for sure. So that's why I come back to that that roadmap is full function, like it's a plan, right? But then as you go and you execute, you'll meet new constraints. And all I'm doing in this type of work is I see myself as an Excel solver, right? Like, give me the constraints and I'll solve for the constraints that we know about, right? And then as new constraints come in, I'll solve again, but it will change the answer, right? So as many constraints as we can consider at the front end, it'll give us a good plan, but inevitably new constraints come in or get taken off. And so you need to consider that in the road mapping as well, and we modify it based on that, right? But you're always trying to move forward, move up the maturity curve, move up in the stability of your enterprise. But I've never come to the end of a mandate with a client. We looked at all the system architecture. We go, yeah, it's done. Like that never happens, right? So it's always, you're always restarting. There's always something to do to get more value out of your system architecture and out of your procurement organization. It's just how far along are you to that 100%, right? And if you manage to be between 80 and 90, wow, in my book, you're perfect. You should consider yourself at 100, right? Because there's always going to be, to your point earlier, the M&A, new plants, changes in the business strategy, et cetera, that you have to adapt to over time as well. So you're never done.
Yeah, and it kind of it raises the point of the value of trying to keep things simple, because there's so much complexity going on around you. Just trying to keep solutions simple and trying to keep processes simple, not overcomplicating things for the sake of it. I think, if you take services procurement as an example, it can almost be infinitely complicated. But the fundamental underlying way that people buy services and measure what they got for their money and understand who did what, how well they did, and what that means for the future is relatively straightforward. It's just quite specific. Even if you take the way of looking at kind of fixed price, milestone deliverable type work versus time and materials, it can get very complicated where people are making decisions around things like rate cards, but actually that's not really reflective of what's being done and how much the project's costing, in the sense that, if your rate card is based on X, Y, and Z type of associate, consultant, director, whoever it may be, who's actually doing the work, how much of the time are you getting of these particular individuals? But also, if consultancy A is quoting X amount of time at X amount of rates, that doesn't necessarily translate into what's actually delivered. Oh, well, it took us twice as long. The other consultancy were more expensive, but these guys have cost you twice the length of time. So it's not as simple, but just measuring the simple things means that you can then look back on it and get more insights. But I find it incredibly complex just dealing with the services procurement arena. For you to deal with this as to how it fits in with everything else within a specific organization, that's a lot of complexity to deal with. Do you kind of like find yourself waking up at night with like spreadsheets going through your head?
No. Well, maybe when things are going less than optimal, it does happen sometimes. It's more in the shower where I'll be like showering and then you go, oh, and then I write stuff on the wall and I go like, oh yeah, this is what we need to do. But no, and again, I've been in this space, 10, 12 years, and it remains interesting. I keep learning every day as well. Like, I don't have all the answers for sure. And there's new technologies I don't know about, but I think the baggage I bring to clients is helping accelerate them through that journey and meeting them where they're at, right? So if I meet a client where, you know, the technology literacy is not zero but close, like they do everything in Word and Excel and SharePoints and shared drives, then I'm going to have a much different conversation than if they've already got an ERP, a source to pay platform in place, their sourcing's optimized, they're looking just for you know, to address a specific category like services. The conversation is going to be very different, right? Depending on their spend profile in the industry as well. So that's what keeps it interesting for me. And yeah, I don't have all the answers off the bat, but I can surely get them, right? Like, so it's been building that baggage over time in terms of yeah, the entire value chain, and then going deep in different processes over time as well, and then being able to take that and reapply it and tweak it and change it for different contexts.
Well, it's like you say, constantly solving for the constraints, revisiting, there are new constraints, solve for those constraints. I like that. I think that was a really good way to describe it. So let's take an example of an organization that's gone through the process pretty well so far. They're at a relatively high level of maturity, but as you say, there's always more that you can do. And there are external factors that are changing as well. So if we look at visibility, so visibility is crucial in terms of what are we spending our money on? What are we getting for that money? Which suppliers are doing a good job? Where are we working well? Where are we not working well? What in the future for these types of projects, which suppliers should we be looking at? Where do we need to build our supply base? What are the things, what are the key kind of themes around visibility that you're seeing coming up at the moment?
A lot of it is spend, right? And like the base is spend, and not everybody has that base covered, especially in a context where they have a bunch of different applications, right? So it goes back to what you were saying around trying to keep things simple, right? I always say as simple as possible, but no simpler. I think it's an Einstein quote, if I'm not mistaken. So the same thing applies to system architecture, right? Like, don't make it as more complex than it needs to be, because to that point, if I add a new system, then the data objects, the purchase orders, the invoices, etc., are going to be in that other system, and I need to integrate that into my spend cube, into my spend application, to be able to have visibility over that. And I also need to, you know, try to standardize all the data models so that when I'm filtering on fields, like I can filter through the whole data at the same time, right? So that's one thing, just being able to have a consolidated view of spend. And then depending on, you know, different parts of the world, there's ESG, so you know, social governance, being able to capture additional information on suppliers that we weren't traditionally capturing, right? So whether it be certifications for certain ISO standards or certain social standards, whether it be, you know, the minority-owned businesses information and diversity information. So being able to capture that, integrate it into the decision piece, and then the other large domain that I'm seeing is on time and in full information, right? So really pushing the transactions to getting confirmations from suppliers, getting advanced shipment notices from suppliers, which used to be really just, you know, your top 5-10 suppliers where you have huge volume. They have the IT capabilities to give you those confirmations and give you those advanced shipment notices. We're wanting to push that down the supplier tail to be able to get that information for all types of suppliers, and then be able to identify opportunities based on that, right? So there's the meeting those diversity targets, but also, to your point, being able to get that information around supplier performance in a way that's not manual as much as possible, and then being able to drive category strategy decisions based on that data, right? So those are like the three big pieces I'd see, right? So just getting your spend cube correct or full of all the data that you need from your different systems. Second is integrating that ESG and diversity information and making business decisions based on that. And the complexity there is just, you know, supplier hierarchies, right? Where, like, if I have subsidiaries and different legal entities that all represent the same supplier, being able to sort that out and then match the ESG information at the right level is the biggest problem or pain point I see in that space. And then on time and full.
Yeah, I was going to say with the ESG, particularly when it gets into things that are highly complex, like carbon at the moment, like carbon emissions, and actually looking at that, you know, the biggest gains that organizations can make in terms of optimizing carbon is quite often within their supply chain. And it's just, getting that but that's a whole new layer of information that maybe people haven't collected previously.
That's right, and I haven't bumped into that yet, but I'm sure it's one or two mandates away, right? but yeah, collecting that info, and typically it'll be a third party service provider that you're pulling data from, right? Or if you're trying to do it yourself to collect certain information from suppliers, it's also putting that infrastructure in place, which is different, or is a new challenge that I'm thinking about right now, because you're making me aware of it.
So when you were talking just there about advanced on time information, are you kind of talking about real time effectively? You start.
I meant like shipment information, right? So if I have a purchase order and I want my supplier, so I send them a purchase order, and in my system, we have a lead time 7 days, or I've gotten from his catalog that the lead time is approximately 7 days. Well, I would like a confirmation back from that supplier for both lead time, quantity, and price, right? His price hasn't changed since the last, since I took it from his catalog, or since my price lists have been updated. So I want a confirmation on those 3 things. And right now we're either chasing for them by email, or we're getting them manually. We're not necessarily capturing the information in our systems. So having a dedicated way, or a way to capture those confirmations and update our orders and plan around those updated dates or confirmed dates is one thing. And then the second piece is advanced shipment notifications, right? So when they close the doors to the truck, they send you essentially the same information that was on your confirmation, but updated at the time of shipment, right? So they can say, we told you the delivery date was going to be on the 10th, but we just closed the doors to the truck. Here's what's in there. We're missing 2 pieces we thought we'd have, and we're going to be there on the 11th finally. So that's the advanced shipment notice. And so you're able to make just-in-time adjustments right before the delivery date as needed, based on that ASN information. And it makes receiving a lot more simpler as well, because I could just say, okay, receive everything that's in the ASN, instead of having to manually count everything that's in the truck, right? So getting that information, or those 2 types of messages, lower down your supplier tail, and then being able to leverage that information for category management decisions, for adjusting your strategy. Like, hey, we only have a really small volume with this supplier in this category, but they're hitting all their OTIF, on time in full, notifications or thresholds fairly consistently. Let's try them with more quantity, right? That can be something that comes out of that, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it's real-time risk management effectively, and as you say, applying that to the overarching category strategy. And I think, interestingly, the same is starting to become more of an ask in complex services as well, where people are just wanting, how do you know when a project is off course? Right. Are people hitting their milestones? Are procurement involved in that process, where rather than just infinite invisible change orders going through in the background and then, just a big invoice hitting, are procurement able to be aware that this project's going off track, this is overrunning, and understand why, and actually get involved in that process and help as it goes? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings that can happen in all areas if that's not communicated properly. Is it the supplier's fault, or is it not actually the supplier's fault? There's a external situation that slowed that supplier down, whether it's in a shipping point of view, or whether it's in a delivery of a service, or whether
a change in assumptions. Yeah, no, exactly. For sure. I see applicability there for sure. And if you've got a massive portfolio of projects going on within your business, and you're using the big 4, to a lot of different, for a lot of those different projects, being able to have that consolidated picture of, okay, well, we gave these guys 12 projects, and all 12 of them were delivered outside the initial timeline and cost scoped out at the beginning, right? And then to your point, why is that, right? Was it the assumptions, or is it really the supplier wasn't able to deliver on their promises, and then being able to integrate that into future decisions, for sure. And so I don't see an issue with the applications being able to support that. The big issue is putting in place the processes, the mentalities, and the data capture habits at the source, right? With folks that are on the projects, with procurement as well, coaching their stakeholders, and that's the tough part, right? I think the technology will help us get there, for sure.
There's so many more fascinating areas I'd love to dive into in more detail. We're going to have to kind of start wrapping this up soon, but just out of interest, in terms of what you're doing, where do you see things with your business? Where do you see it, or where do you want to see it progress towards? What's the kind of medium-term goals for you?
Yeah, my big issue is there's only 24 hours in a day.
Only just over.
Yeah,
Just over
yeah.
24 hours
No,
in a
that's
normal
right.
working day.
That's a small smidge. That's right. That's right. Maybe I'm not making use of that smidge enough.
Got to try harder.
No, I think it just, to me, it's I'm a solo practitioner. I don't necessarily intend to grow a firm or anything like that. Like, for me, it's really about the work, about understanding the complexity, and getting my sleeves up and my hands dirty with folks in the work. And I feel that allows me to have conversations at all levels, right? Whether it's strategic, tactical, and operational levels. And I enjoy those different types of conversations. So I think it's more of the same, and I'll keep doing it until I figure, I know everything, which is never, right. So I think it remains interesting for me. And I think it's just more putting in place more, not methodologies, but frameworks, right? Way of thinking about things to simplify the journey for folks. So whether that's writing articles, potentially writing a book on the topic of how do I, as a CPO, what do I have to do to meet my business objectives with technology in the current state of affairs, right? In terms of the market and what I need my folks to have as skills and abilities.
I think you're in a great place at a great time, and you're going to have so much information going through everything that you're doing that, you really will have gathered up an amazing amount of experience. So I think it's really interesting, and fair play to you. You also have a podcast going, don't you? So I've noticed.
I do. Yeah. So you could go on my site, pureprocurement.ca. And I have some articles there. I have a couple podcasts as well. I have to say it's more of a passion project that I'll do once in a while, more than a podcast that comes out every week, right? So we go deep into certain verticals or certain types of solutions, and often my thinking about it is, okay, well, for a given process within the procurement value chain, what's the best practices, what's the guidelines that I need to be thinking about for that process with no technology, and then how do I solve for that with no technology? And then what obstacles do I run into when I don't have technology, whether it's a volume obstacle, a complexity, a data gathering obstacle, and then what kind of technologies are out there and can help me solve those pain points. So that's the typical structure of the podcast. And otherwise, I'll post on LinkedIn once in a while as well. For me, it's just about having interesting conversations with interesting people, and upping the maturity of procurement in general with technology over time. And as long as that's happening and it remains interesting, you'll be able to talk to me about it.
Brilliant stuff. Well, I think you're doing some great work. It's really interesting to talk to you. I really appreciate the time, and yeah, that's the way that you talk about things is just so structured. I really like that. And it's put some great kind of pictures in my head about how you do what you're doing. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me.
Well, I appreciate you guys inviting me, Johnny. It's been a pleasure, and hope to do this again soon.
Excellent stuff. Thanks very much, Joel.
Bye-bye.